I would like to call the Petoskey Planning Commission regular meeting this Wednesday, April 19th, 2023 to order at 6 p.m. Roll call.
Freda. Present.
Here.
Robson. Wilmot.
Here.
All right. First order item on the agenda is approval of minutes. The March 16th minutes we'll do first. Any questions, comments? Take a motion to approve.
I move to approve the March 16th minutes.
Second.
Okay, Rick made the motion to approve. Charlie seconded. All in favor, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
All right, that passes. And then we move on to April 5th, 2023 special meeting. Any comments, questions? And I'll take a motion.
I move to approve. Second.
Okay, Charlie made the motion to approve. Matt seconded. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Right, done. All right. Welcome to our public. We move on to new business. Agenda item 3A in new business, introduction for a rezoning request from R2 to I1 for 1624 Clarion Avenue and scheduling a public hearing possibly. John, do you want to?
Yes, I can, Madam Chair. Members of the commission, the city received a rezoning application from Brian Hall, who owns property on Clarion Avenue, which is his parent parcel is zoned I1, and he has a small parcel adjacent to it that is zoned R2. And in the staff analysis, if you look on page 2 of the analysis, you can see the parcel lines based on the aerial photograph. And you can see the parcel that's highlighted in red is the parcel that is zoned R2 that he would like to zone R1, or industrial 1, I1, with the thought that he's going to combine these parcels if the property is so rezoned. The property along Clarion, much of it is already zoned light industrial. The property across the street between Clarion and the Bear River is also zoned industrial. The master plan has this area in a variety of different zoning districts, primarily mixed use, but it does have I1 and I2 located along this area. I don't see any reason or conflict with the community master plan. So my recommendation is that the Planning Commission schedule a public hearing.
Okay, and Brian Hall has joined us on Zoom. Do you have any comments?
Hi, good afternoon. I don't have any comments at this time.
All right, thank you, Brian. All right, I bring it to the Planning Commission for discussion.
Well, it certainly seems to make this request certainly seems to make sense to me, even though it is adjacent to an R2 parcel to the south, but the adjoining R2 parcel is largely hillside, which I guess we're thinking is probably not developable. And this parcel, I guess, originally was maybe part of the larger I1 parcel that Mr. Hall already owns. And since the eastern end of it is kind of below the hillside or at the bottom of the hillside and has access along I don't know if that's a public right of way that comes in there.
That is a public right of way, yes.
Yeah. And it does have access to a public right of way. Personally, I think it does make sense to have this parcel be rezoned to be I1.
Okay, Carolyn, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just looking at a proposed condensed zoning map that we had received, I don't know, a few months back. And it appears to be that this parcel was, the idea was to make it the I1. I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention.
Okay.
And also, if this little parcel is partially on the hill, I guess a question for the applicant is, what are you going to be using that extra piece of property for? Or do you have an intent for combining?
Currently at this time, I don't have a future intent for it. My current plan is just, I would like to zone it also it's uniformed, right? Because right now I kind of have 3 parcels and it's mixed. I prefer them to all to be I1, so they're standardized and uniformed at this time.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Okay, I'd entertain a motion to schedule a public hearing.
I'll make a motion based on the documentation submitted as part of the public record to schedule a public hearing to consider the rezoning of parcel 52-19-7-201-059 from R2 to I1 light industrial for May 17th, 2023.
Okay,
A second.
all right. Bethany makes the motion. Charlie seconds to approve for a special hearing, and we would do that at our the May meeting. Okay. So that's the motion, and all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right. Motion passes. Thank you, Brian. Moving on to agenda item 3B in new business discussion on ordinance language for short-term rentals. I did want to let everyone know that one thing that was a little confusing is that on the corrected copy, it said that the license would be from January 1 to December 31. The public safety and the city manager had made a decision that it would be the April 1 to March 31 because they need prep time to process the application. So if the deadline to receive all the information is December 31, that gives the city 3 months to do what they need to do to approve the licenses. So that language got changed back to what it was originally,
So it's back to April 1st.
to March 31st.
There was a November 1st in here too. Does that change anything?
Well, the November 1st is when they send out the notices. That's when you could apply.
Okay.
So it's like, what do they
Gotcha.
call that? Like an open window. I forget what they call that. But your time is is it November 1 to December 31st? Yeah.
Okay.
So they give them 2 months to get their ducks in a row. Okay, John?
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing I wanted to point out first with the Planning Commission is that there's a need for 2 ordinances. One is a police power ordinance. That's the licensing ordinance that controls the regulations, the application procedures, the fees, etc. That one is adopted specifically by the city council as a police power. The second ordinance is actually an amendment to the zoning code, which then regulates what district or what districts the short-term rentals would be located, and any other type of planning requirements that you want to add to the ordinance, to the zoning code. So there's 2 ordinances that are submitted in your packet. The first one that's marked up was the ordinance that had been reviewed, preliminary review by the city council. And then we use that as the basis to make some modifications. And I worked with Lisa on the modifications, as well as Matt Cross, the city attorney, took a look at what we prepared for the PC packet. Matt thought it was in good enough shape to bring to the Planning Commission to start the conversation. My suggestion is, this is a hot topic. We already have 33 short-term rentals in the city. 19 are grandfathered in because they're all in the residential districts. And there's probably more on the way. So I think action is needed sooner than later. And this can be a hot issue in a community. So I want to get it on the radar screen and get the Planning Commission working on it as soon as possible. So we can start tonight. My suggestion is, in order to move this forward quicker, I would suggest, with the chairman's concurrence, that we have a subcommittee of 2 or 3 PC members that would meet with Lisa and I to go over the second iteration of this. So we have something that is close to being adopted at your May meeting to keep pushing it. I don't want to wait every 30 days to go through a conversation and then another iteration of it. So, but if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to address them. I'm kind of coming in this midstream, so I'm somewhat familiar with the ordinance that the city council had preliminary reviewed, but let's open it up for discussion and see where we go.
Okay. Charlie.
Yeah, I have a preliminary question for you, John, and that is, this was, language was presented to us at the February meeting, and we were told that the planning commission was not to be involved in the text and the language, but rather only in making a recommendation to council with regard to the number of short-term rental units that we would recommend. So there's a different process underway now. Could you explain?
With the city planner, Zach, was working on the ordinance that was being presented to city council. In my capacity as planning consultant, I've taken that responsibility over. However, I think there needs to be a match between the licensing ordinance and the zoning code. So my preference is for the planning commission to take a look at both. So both of the ordinances are in sync with each other. And then we would proceed going to city council. That's my recommendation.
Thank you, and I agree with that.
And yet, Rick?
Oh, yeah, I've got a couple comments to make. Thank you. Yes, I have a couple comments to make, and this is I'll call it the city council version of the ordinance. The first one, on page 4, about halfway down, it would be item number 4, a schematic will be supplied. As an architect, I would suggest, just put the word schematic drawing. When you say schematic, I'm not sure what that means exactly, other than we use the term schematic drawing, which means, an early preliminary sketchy type drawing. So I would just insert the word drawing in there. But my larger question, I guess, has to do with what zoning districts the short-term rental ordinance would apply to. And I know that in the intent, it states that, it could not be used in residential, single family or multifamily districts. That's sort of stated in the intent, but yet when I went through the whole ordinance here, I couldn't find any specific sentence or section that basically said that as part of the ordinance.
Rick, that is part of the zoning ordinance. This is like the policing ordinance.
Okay.
But it's in the zoning, and we have the districts right here listed
Yeah, I see that.
for our consideration.
I just didn't know if it should be stated in this other one as well.
Let me address that, Commissioner. The reason why we don't state it in the licensing is we don't want to run into a conflict where one ordinance may be amended in the future and the other one is not. So the police power ordinance regulates and licenses. The zoning code ordinance specifies where they're going to go.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense then. Those were the 2 comments I had. Thank you.
Does anybody have general questions about the police power short-term rental ordinance?
I did have one question, and maybe I'm just not seeing it, but it seemed to me that we discussed the number last time of 40, and it looked like that wasn't listed anywhere in here.
Right.
The city council just hasn't decided yet. Is that?
Well, that is one of the questions, is where does the cap info go? Does it go in the police power or in the ordinance?
Capping would go in the licensing.
Okay.
Because I think maybe what I'd like to move on to is, do we want to set up a group to look at this and then present back to the planning commission?
Yeah, I'm certainly on board with that. But maybe before we do, I'd like to also address these questions that John has in his cover note to us. There's a number of questions. And so he says, number one, in what zoning districts will short-term rentals be allowed by right? And it seems to me that we're saying that in all non-residential zones, except for, I believe we want to accept the B2 Central Business District ground floor, and not allow them in the CBD ground floor by special land use. How about, do we want to have some kind of input on PUDs? You know, if one were proposed to be in a PUD, would we want to consider that, you know, especially, or should that just be part of everything else except for residential? That was a question. I don't know.
Okay.
So those were my basic comments relative to John's questions here on his memo.
Madam Chair, may I?
Yeah.
The reason why I'm asking about where you want these is you're gonna see an application at the May meeting for the possible conversion of the former Chinese restaurant on Mitchell to a short-term rental. And I wanted to explore with the planning commission what the policy is, the public policy of encouraging the conversion of commercial properties in your D districts into short-term rentals. Specifically because the city is landlocked, you're surrounded by a charter township. And unless you can persuade them on doing a 425 annexation agreement, the commercial property that you have is the commercial property that you're gonna only have. So do you want to start the process of converting that into short-term rentals? It's a policy issue that the planning commission needs to think about.
Yeah, that is an interesting idea. I mean, I think on a main US highway like that, the highest and best use is for it to remain commercial. And not to allow something like a short-term rental kind of use on a ground floor.
And my intent is not to bias the applicant because he has withdrawn his application until May, because I wanted to have an opportunity to talk to the planning commission about it. One of the things I want to explore with him, we've talked on the phone, was the possible conversion of that property, not to a short-term rental, but to a boutique hotel, which would be consistent then with the zoning, which allows for hotels and motels. I don't know if he's going to be willing to do that, but he is willing. He wants to sit down in May and have a meeting with us at the city about that idea. But the question is bigger than just that piece of property.
Yeah.
It's when you pass an ordinance like this, sometimes there's unintended consequences. So I want you to think about this. Do you, as a planning commission, want to start sacrificing some of your commercial properties along 31 to conversion to short-term rentals? I mean, if you think that's something that you want to do, that's fine. But it's a question I need to ask.
Well, I think we're going to be faced with some real questions regarding our commercial properties. I mean, right now you sort of look at what's out there and there's so many vacancies, in our malls, like, the Hobby Lobby mall, but gosh, that's like largely 3/4 empty. It looks like right now. And, even out in Bear Creek Meadows, that commercial development has a lot of vacancies as well. And then in Bay Mall, there's vacancies there as well. So I agree with you that they are limited commercial properties and should be maintained as commercial properties, generally speaking, but there seems to be a real dearth of commercial, what am I trying to say? The shopping centers.
Yeah, used.
Yeah, your dearth of tenants, right? I thought for quite a while that like the Bay Mall, somebody ought to come along and buy the property on the north edge of Bay Mall and propose a row of townhouses along there. That mall could easily give up the parking spaces that would be associated with building some condos there that would have a beautiful view, or apartments, or maybe another motel or something that could take advantage of part of that underutilized shopping center. And the same is going to be true with the Hobby Lobby one too. I mean, what's going to become of that? There's just a lot of empty parking down there, maybe it could be rethought with some apartment, get rid of some of that parking and redevelop it as apartments or something. I don't know, but that's kind of off the subject, but it kind of fits into the larger question about how we envision
Right.
the future of our commercial properties.
The thing is, what you're discussing, those are all PUDs,
Yeah.
so they have the potential of being changed.
Is Bay Mall PUD?
I think it's B3.
Bay Mall is B3?
Yeah.
Okay.
But the Hobby Lobby one certainly is
Mhm.
PUD.
Question.
Yes,
Rest of you, I guess that's.
We don't necessarily need to change the zoning from commercial. If we, in addition, allow short-term rentals in that zone, correct? So we're not necessarily losing the commercial property for the future. What we're doing is giving the landowner, the property owner, the right to choose for highest and best use.
Correct. Yes, but you have to do that within the context of your master plan,
Yes.
within the context of your master.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
anybody else?
I think a subcommittee is going to need to do a deep dive on this.
Yeah, I would have to say that for like Mitchell Street, where that one is asked to be not commercial.
Mhm.
I think that area ought to stay, the whole thing be commercial, what you do on the second story.
That's what I was gonna
is-
say. Upper stories could be.
Upper
something
stories
similar.
are, can be other things,
Mhm.
Right.
but I don't think, I don't think we should give up. And I just think short-term rentals don't fit with the type of commercial that's particularly on Mitchell Street.
I totally agree that all first floor should be dedicated to commercial, whether it's vacant or whether it has a tenant or not, should be devoted to commercial. I agree with that in terms of a long-term strategy for the community.
Mhm.
Yeah, the property that I'm talking about, just to be perfectly fair to the applicant, his concern is that the property's been available for sale for quite some time and he hasn't had any offers.
Mhm.
The other limiting factor to that piece of property is there's no left-hand turn lane in front of it. So if people got to turn left, they're in the through lane and they're turning left, blocking traffic.
Mhm.
And that's been one of the problems, the obstacles he's had to leasing it out is people want to be where there's a dedicated left-hand turn. So he's in a situation where that's not available and it will not be available based on the geometrics of the road. So he does have a situation there. But on the flip side, he also has the benefit that the lot goes all the way back to Jefferson and he has 2 curb cuts there. The one thing I wanted to explore with the PC was when you do have a first floor only building like he has, does it make sense to allow the short-term rental in the back as long as some portion of the building in the front is available for office or small retail use? That's an option maybe for the subcommittee to take a look at.
I suppose there's more traffic these days, but I remember when that was the Flapjack Shack
Mhm.
and it worked fine, as a commercial with lots of in and outs by cars. I mean, they seemed to be able to make it work, but maybe there was less traffic on 31 than there is today.
Oh, I love the Japanese restaurant too, and they're gone, so.
Matt?
Well, I was just gonna say, you can get on a Jefferson Street from the back of that parking lot and get the right.
Mhm.
Then make a left if you needed to, so it's not impossible.
Mhm.
Yeah, food for thought.
Yes,
So, what do we do to do a subcommittee?
make a motion and then with the number and then ask for volunteers.
Okay. So in terms of the subcommittee, do you think 3 is enough or do we want more? Okay. And then I would say, meet at least once between now and the May one, unless we feel like that we have 2 meetings would be necessary.
What would I mean, I'm sure we'll discuss this, but time commitment as far as what evenings during the day?
I think it would just depend on the 3. Feel it could be flexible. So, does anyone want to make a motion to?
I make a motion that a special committee be established for further discussion of the text and the issues involved with regard to the short-term rental
Okay.
ordinances, both ordinances. And that they meet at least once, if not twice, between now and the next meeting.
Mhm. Okay. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so Charlie made the motion, Bethany seconded. All in favor? Aye. All right, so I think that I can ask for volunteers and then I choose who goes on it. Okay, do I have any volunteers? Charlie? Rick? Okay. I volunteer. Does anybody else want to volunteer?
That's fine with me.
Yeah.
Okay. You want to volunteer?
No, I'm good.
Oh. All right, well then, Rick.
Charlie,
Thank you, Charlie and I will.
thank you guys.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes, all right. So is that, should we discuss this briefly to get a feel for what people are thinking on that as well? So you guys take notes. So I guess what we're looking at first is in terms of the districts, short-term rentals, number 1, A through D. Does anybody feel that something doesn't belong there or feel that something else ought to be there?
I'm sorry, which document?
Okay, we're now on the zoning administration. So the one page, 2-sided.
Oh, one.
Yeah.
So did we ever adapt the mixed business district when we combine these districts into the mixed business district or no?
I don't know what happened with
That's
that.
in the process.
Lisa says no.
So did it fail at city council level? Or did it just, what happened?
Yeah, I thought we moved that to city council.
I don't think my recollection was there was some work that still needed to be done on it and
Okay.
staff was going to rework that. And I believe that was at the
Okay,
February meeting.
yeah, that sounds right.
And then that's kind of,
Because it seems silly to change an ordinance and then go back and change it again to condense the zoning.
Yeah. Might have to do that, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of hate to hold this, I feel like needs
Yeah,
to
I agree.
get done sooner than later. And you know what? After the city council approves it, then it goes to Muni code and there's a delay before that actually gets officially into the ordinance. So it's not just city council and planning commission work, then it goes outside. So, although once it goes to Muni code, it's still usable, it's just not in the zoning book.
correct.
Yeah, all right. So I didn't quite have that right.
And then what was our consensus on not allowing them in the residential districts again? If anyone remembers?
Well, it's just a lot of impact on neighbors.
But how many of the 19 that are grandfathered are in our residential areas?
There are more than 19 grandfathered. There
19 are in
19
residential
are in
areas.
19
And already 3 years, yeah.
throughout.
Right.
Okay.
And if you talk to people who have them in the neighborhood,
Right,
it's a conflict.
yeah, okay,
Not all of them, some of them are well run, but,
yeah. Okay,
So.
and I also,
What was your question? What are the issues involved? I think this is a very important topic to talk to. What are the issues involved with regard to the selection of the zones
yeah,
that this new ordinance will apply?
right, I mean,
But yeah, that's one of the issues that he put on his questions.
Yeah.
What are those issues?
Well, I wondered about, would we want to include the B2A, which is a transitional business district that surrounds, well, it doesn't surround, but it touches the CBD.
yeah,
It seems to me that short-term rentals would be appropriate to be able to be located in that district, as long as they're not in the CBD or on the ground floor of the CBD. Do we want to include that here? That, because I don't see B2 central business listed here. We could say, oh, right, there it is, B2 central business district. Don't we want to say except for ground floor
well, I think
after
that
1B?
because these are all business districts, that the policy is going to be no ground floor, only upper floors. For all of them.
like we said, it could be the back half of some of them.
Mhm.
Well,
But to be careful with that, because CBD or B2, we don't want to give up that, we've had discussions about it and
Yeah.
it didn't go anywhere.
Right.
And in part, it's like, again, that finite amount of retail or commercial that we have to be careful about cluttering that up with something where it can't go back to being commercial later. So for instance, if somebody built
Yeah,
a short-term rental on the back of a downtown business, well, now it's unlikely that would get torn out and it could go back to
right,
the commercial use.
So from a 30,000-foot view, the big question here is, why not allow this for all zones? Why protect residential?
Does anybody else have a lot to say about that?
well, I know I have from personal experience that having a short-term rental next to your home is a real bother. People arrive, every weekend, there's new people unloading and parking stuff, in your yard and people running around and dogs and noise. And I found it to be very disturbing when the property next to me was a short-term rental.
And a bigger issue is that there are corporations coming into towns and buying up housing just for short-term rentals. We have a housing shortage. So I believe that it's in the master plan. We need to protect the residential housing we have. For instance, ADUs are allowed in residential areas. I don't think they should ever be short-term rentals. The goal of having those was to gain more residential use. And that's the way it's written. You can't be for less than 3 months. That's what we want for the residential. And when when those things change to short-term rentals, then all the property prices shoot up. Then no one can afford them. And so then they become investment for corporations. So it's just this horrible catch-22 that doesn't enable us to protect our residential areas.
And I understand and agree with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side, the question is that most of the properties that are currently licensed as short-term rentals are in the residential neighborhoods. And we are proposing to write something that restricts that from the future, other than grandfather. And the question is, and I'm not an attorney, the question is that defensible in court or as a matter of ethics and propriety?
Well, as long as they renew their license each year,
I understand that they're allowing them to do it, but not allowing other people to do it. Is that defensible in court?
Well, the other thing that protects that,
If I may, it's the same issue that you have with non-conforming uses. That the non-conforming uses are grandfathered in. It's the same principle. That the STRs are grandfathered in. Essentially, in the residential district, they're non-conforming because they don't meet the current code, if the code is adopted. And like Commissioner Newman mentioned, when they don't renew their license, then the property converts back into a year-round residential parcel.
And I understand all of this. I'm just trying to air it in front of the commission so that we discuss the 30,000-foot view on this. Because these, I think, are relevant issues as to why are we limiting this to certain zones, and especially under the circumstances that the majority of short-term rental licenses today are in the residential area. I just think we have to be careful about how we structure this to make sure that it is, appropriate legislation going forward, regulation.
One of the things that I want to point out is, fortunately for Petoskey, you have 33 so far. 33 short-term rentals that you know of. Because there's probably some out there that you don't know that are being short. For sure. Okay. The issue that some communities are facing is that around 5% of their housing stock now is converted into short-term rentals. And that's pretty significant. 2.5% of your housing stock, that'd be roughly 84. So you are right now around 1% of your housing stock is short-term rentals. Legally, which gives you the time then to set the cap. If the longer you wait to pass an ordinance, the higher that cap may go artificially. And you don't want to sacrifice 2.5%, 3 or 4% of your housing stock to short-term rentals, because it will happen. In some communities, short-term rentals make up 20% of their housing stock.
Wow, that's unacceptable.
That's very unacceptable. But see, they didn't react fast enough.
Right. So totally understood. I just thought this conversation was necessary to focus in on it. Another issue that I had was the definition of what a short-term rental is. First of all, I don't know about anybody else, but I had to read it about 8 times to really get my arms around it. But it's clear that in accordance with the way that the definition of short-term rentals is currently written, anybody in Petoskey can do Airbnb of their properties, if assuming that they only do it for less than 28 days a year. And the question is that the way we want it to read?
No. You don't.
So, but that's the way the draft currently.
That's right.
So is that something that will be addressed by the subcommittee then?
Yes.
Thank you.
and back to what we were just talking about before, and I'm not saying that I think they should be allowed in residential districts, because I completely agree. Like, the number one reason I think we should get our hands on this is because we need housing for people who live here. But by setting that number of 40 or however many it is, that does kind of protect against every home on the block becoming a short-term rental. I do understand the impact of that on the neighbors, and it's a lot. But I think that is a discussion that we should continue having.
Well, the impact on the neighbors presumably will be dealt with an enforcement officer and the code as far as nuisance and so forth. And I understand we're a long way from that, but the point is that once these criteria are established, we need to make sure that there's teeth in it.
Yeah.
That the neighbors that are impacted are not disrupted unnecessarily.
Right. Essentially, if you have so many violations, you could lose your license.
Well, and that's specified here too, but it's also, the language is a little confusing on that as well. So.
Yeah. And I feel like, we shouldn't allow it in the residential, but at the same time, if some people have it, and people need extra income, it's a great way for people to maybe make a mortgage payment or,
For sure.
you know, it's.
But they could also not do short-term rentals, but rent out a bedroom or, I mean, there's ways of doing it that still provides long-term housing,
Longer than 30 days.
longer than 30 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is directed at the Airbnb,
Yeah.
2-day, 5-day.
Which is where you make your money.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
big money,
Big time.
which is what the threat is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, if you allow that, then it does the same damage to the housing prices. And that's one of the things I'm trying to protect, is that people can still afford to buy the houses. So if you still allow short-term rental in residential areas, that puts pressure on everything else, and it still creates more expensive houses if you allow it. So like residential to me is sacred,
Yeah,
and we really need to protect it.
yeah. And I think it could possibly deteriorate the fabric of the neighborhood. You know, just if you have people in your neighborhood that you don't even know coming and going, you have no idea who they are. I don't necessarily think that's a good thing.
No, I agree with that. But I also feel like if you had an ADU and you were living in the primary residence, could you Airbnb or short-term rental out your ADU?
Well, I mean, if we allowed it, yes, but again, it goes back to, we allowed those ADUs and we restricted them so they couldn't be short-term rentals, because what our goal was is to achieve long-term housing.
Yeah. So we're saying all residential zones?
Yeah,
Even
not
the-
allowed,
Even the R2,
right?
3.
Because when you get into apartment buildings, if you allowed some of the apartment buildings to become short-term rentals, not only are they good, you know, in your space, but you are going to deal with their all-night parties. I mean, it's too disruptive for long-term housing to tolerate that, in my opinion.
I agree.
So residential is off the list, but what about some of like the industrial, the light industrial? What else do we have to have on our list here?
Well, like Rick mentioned, what was it, the B2A?
Transitional business? The B3A
B2B.
resort commercial?
Yeah, personally, I would say just anything but residential, pretty much.
So the B3A resort commercial on the west side of town, is that some of those condos at the
Yes.
edge of the bluff?
At the edge of the block.
Like you go past across from the fairgrounds on the lake side,
Mhm.
is that in the B3 resort commercial or is that like, yeah, so it's,
All right, Charlevoix. Huh,
so that
it
would
just shows it as park and hospital.
Beyond the cemetery there, I mean,
No, right here.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And
Those-
just-
yeah, there are those,
oh, maybe that's supposed to be B3B business industrial or.
Or is that supposed to be? Oh,
It must
there's
be.
two greens.
Do you know how to identify the columns are so close?
oh yeah, it is business industrial,
Yeah.
okay,
Okay.
and those are condos, okay.
Right. Okay,
But is that an association?
There's,
yes, it is.
If it's an association, then the association rules will trump anyway.
yeah, there's actually, I think, 3 associations there.
Which is a very interesting question, that kind of a random question for the planner, is that can neighborhoods within the city create an association?
Yes,
So that's another control mechanism that could be instituted by neighborhoods.
but it's got to be done within a legal context.
I understand, yes.
Yeah. That's a high ask,
Yeah.
to ask neighborhoods to protect themselves. That's a high ask.
Well, I know there is.
I'm not suggesting that we should, I'm just saying it, sorry, it was a random question.
Right.
What about how we have the B&B 500-foot radius from another one?
Mhm.
Do we want to?
Okay, I
be
feel
specific.
strongly, but I'm only one member on the commission, that residential sacred.
I agree, residential's gone,
Yeah.
off the table.
Right, so I'm not getting your question.
Should there be distance requirements? Is that what you're saying between?
Even in commercial locations.
Yeah,
Well, like downtown, if they want to put short-term rentals in the upper stories. Yeah.
that's a lot of
Go.
young people that could live in those.
Keep in mind that the
That's
definition
something
here is a
else.
dwelling unit. And a dwelling unit, you could have multiple dwelling units within the same building. So to have a distance requirement
Yeah.
would inhibit that.
You're right.
And
And it's
motel,
upper stories.
hotels are already short-term situations.
They are, but
They don't have kitchens as such.
Right. they're, and I mean, talk to the neighborhood who borders them. They have the same complaints that you did,
Right.
but,
Yeah, we've heard.
Yeah.
That was them. So then the next question is number of? Is that where we're at?
Well, we settled on 30 at a previous meeting.
So that only opens up 7 licenses?
Yes, but the implication that I received from this updated draft was that the quantity was really up to city council, not up to us.
That's correct.
And my follow-up question to that would be, does that mean that we shouldn't be making a recommendation in terms of quantity?
No, the planning commission should make a recommendation.
Because it sounded like you were taking it off the table.
But the cap is in the licensing agreement, which is under the purview of the.
Understood, but we should still feel free to pursue the question in terms of what should our recommendation be? Okay.
so if we did 40, is that still 1%?
Yes, it's around 1%.
All right,
Do we have current applicants right now, a list?
We have current applicants.
Those go through the city manager's office. The list that we currently have is 33 is as of last Friday. So people can apply at any point in time. But we don't have a wait list as suggested in the ordinance language.
33 people who are licensed and
Correct.
running them now,
Currently, yeah,
and you don't have a waiting list?
No.
Okay.
because we don't have a cap. So there's no,
Oh,
they
got
just
it.
submit them as they choose.
So that seems like a fair place to start. I mean, it could always be revisited in the future if you found that your waiting list was.
Right,
Yeah.
unreasonable.
A question I have, Lisa, or city manager, does the city utilize compliance software like the other communities do to monitor how many B&Bs?
Yeah.
You do? Okay.
But wasn't it recently just established?
What is that with it?
Okay.
And so is it being monitored at this point in time or?
That's good.
Do we have any B and Bs left? Bed and breakfast, do we do those anymore? I know, I think that must be a thing of the past.
All right.
There was only one previously, and that's been a handful of years ago. I believe it was on Wakazoo.
Yeah.
That's the only one that I'm aware of,
Okay,
but I don't know if they continue to relicense.
There were 3 or 4 for a while.
I would suggest that if we're going to make a recommendation to the number, to the cap, that we ought to also provide the city council with an explanation or a defense of that cap, just along, because in a very preliminary straw poll, my understanding is they don't want to see any additions.
so you're saying that your impression of the city
If
council?
we go as the existing 33, we ought to explain why we are recommending that.
Okay. All right. So, so we're gonna add business to B2A, just for closure on that. Is that good enough?
Well, didn't we discuss anything but residential?
Every district but residential and every district but R and RM.
Well, I think office service is supposed to be a transition, so I wouldn't like to see it there.
Even
Because
on upper
Yeah, that's
stories?
Yeah, upper stories it could be. I agree with that.
Should we make the upper story just across the board?
I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree.
Interesting idea. Yeah, I thought of it like that, but I guess as soon as you eliminate residential, then it does make some sense to limit it to upper stories.
Unless it's I don't know if there's any existing conditions where it is commercial.
I can think of one short-term rental. It's across from the library and next to the Christian Scientists. And that
Little bay.
And that is 100%, and I think they have 2 units in there.
They have
They have 4 units, okay. And I think that came to us when we approved it.
yeah.
I know, I remember approving signage. And that one just seems okay. It's downtown. It's not by any real residential area. It's buffered. But it also isn't a continuation. It doesn't break up any commercial. Because it tags onto a church and then it's residential. And there might be offices across from there. So there's one that would not be in compliance anymore that actually is a good use of that property.
That on the list here, those are the 4 units where I'm walking to.
Mhm.
Yes,
And the zoning.
John,
The zoning. There are 4 units around Walkazoo, and the zoning is B2 on those.
And that property is also for sale right now.
Is it really?
Yeah, I saw that on Zillow.
oh,
1.2 million.
I saw that too.
wow.
I wonder
All right.
see how much money they make.
So that would become non-compliant if we only offered upper story.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know that I agree that it should only be
upper story.
upper story.
Well, see, that's the exception to the rule.
Yeah,
And I don't want to
Yeah.
undo some good policy because one would be better off getting to be the way it is, because it is an exception. I don't think there's very many properties out there like that.
and by the way, that property could get around it by simply term leasing the lower floor as opposed to short term.
Sure.
yeah.
But if B2, how does B2 handle? Oh, it's central business district. Yeah, central business district, first floor has to be commercial. So you couldn't long term it as residential
In that house as well? Well, they could term lease to
to an office.
an office.
Mhm.
Well, that was kind of a non-conforming use because it's been residential for a long time. That's the one right on the alley there.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, I don't know if there's an alley, but.
Is
yeah,
that
there is.
grandfathered in then?
Yeah.
That one's grandfathered?
The one that's.
That was pretty recently.
Office.
No, because it's,
Oh,
I thought they had offices on the first floor anyway, but.
no, that's the big Victorian next door.
Right,
Yeah.
so it's those 2 houses we're talking about, right?
Well, the
The
Victoria,
insurance
so those short-term rentals, I don't think
That's
they
around
are.
the corner. That's on Michigan, the insurance office.
So they,
Saddlemeyer.
the ones on Walkazoo, when they're approved,
Yes.
we're currently using the hotel motel regulations in our ordinance because we don't have short-term rental. So when that was approved, motels are allowed on the first floor in the central business district. So that's
Okay.
why that got approved the way it is. Because they are allowed to be on the first floor in the CBD.
Well, that raises an interesting question. How do we differentiate between a short-term rental for 2 or 3 or 5 days and the hotel motel ordinances that we have?
Hotels and motels have offices and staff. Short-term rentals are, you get a key and you let yourself in.
Is that defined in the ordinance?
I don't know.
Well, the ordinance that we're proposing has dwelling size limits for one that has dwelling size limits. But a hotel and motel typically has a bathroom and a bedroom. Some of the newer ones have a small kitchen, but typically it's just a place to sleep. Whereas a short-term rental is a dwelling unit. I mean, it's fully functional, kitchen, bathroom, living area, bedroom. It could be a studio apartment, but still it's fully functional. That's the difference between hotel motel and a short-term rental.
But nevertheless, they were previously approved under the hotel motel ordinance.
Yeah, it's getting a little confusing.
Well, it's a little confusing, but I agree with your comment, Cynthia. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Okay.
I agree with your comment, Cynthia, that we're setting policy here to move forward. And if there's somebody that doesn't meet that new policy, well, we need to have a policy for the community, not just for individual property.
Yeah,
Right.
okay. Carolyn?
I was just bringing it back to our initial. When we started on this little path, is not on the first floor in any commercial.
Right.
That's where we all still stand.
All right, so maybe what we do for short-term rentals, they can't be, but a hotel can have the commercial first floor.
Well, a hotel falls under an entirely different ordinance, right? So
Yeah.
for the short-term rental, no.
Mhm. Is that a distinction we can make?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, so the subcommittee will look at the different districts that are not residential and figure out what's appropriate and what may not be and give the reasons. All right, so standards for short-term rentals.
Oops, sorry, also PUDs. You need to think about PUDs.
Oh, yes, yes. Do we need to do that? Because a PUD, usually they come in and they ask what they want.
Correct. That would be part of the PUD process. If they came in and said, we want to allocate so many units as STRs, that would be part of your deliberation on the PUD. So I don't think you need to put it in the ordinance.
That makes
But
sense.
to allow them in existing PUDs, they would have to come in and reapply.
As an amendment.
But they would have to anyway.
Kind of like
It
the.
wouldn't matter what this said.
big
Okay,
lots.
so PUD
Okay.
language does not to be, need to be in this.
Okay.
It's something we should think about in terms of, we may get PUD requests in the future. And I tell you, if they come and request, I'd rather have long-term housing than short-term rentals. All right, so section 4. Are there any comments about what's there currently?
Well, I had some questions about the parking. Item
Okay.
number 4. But
Okay.
I think, as opposed to debating that now, maybe we ask the subcommittee
Yeah.
to address it. It just seemed to me that arbitrary number of 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit
Mhm.
didn't address the overall issue of the occupancy of those units, how many units per building. It just seemed to be overly simplistic way to address the parking issue.
And that wouldn't apply to the CBD, correct? Because there are no parking. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what is a park? If we're going to make a parking requirement, what does that mean? It mean the parking lot down the street?
Right.
The reason why I put in 2 parking spaces per DU is because that's the requirement for a single family unit,
Okay.
Understood,
is two per unit.
understood.
Okay. Yeah, are there any standards that the subcommittee should consider that haven't been listed? Did anything come to mind for anybody?
Are we missing anything that other towns have in their ordinances under standards?
Well, some of the ordinances that other communities have, they specify the maximum number of occupants per bedroom.
Hmm.
Oh, I thought that was in there. It was 2 occupants per bedroom. And it would have been in the police.
Well, and I have a question about the definition of the word occupant.
Yeah.
Because children are specifically excluded under town. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. To the best of my knowledge, they occupy bed space too. So I had some questions about that, and perhaps you could clarify.
Well, the reason for that is some of the ordinances, and the one that was originally drafted had an occupant would be anybody over 10 years old. And that's because when some families have children, especially small children, they don't necessarily sleep in a bed, they bring their own, you know,
Well, I can see that for infants,
yeah, for
but
infants and,
not 10 years old.
yeah, but other kids, you know, some of the STRs, the kids sleep on the floor in a sleeping blanket. I mean,
So the old woman in the shoe could bring. So I think maybe we need to rethink in some cases, the ordinance calls for occupants, in some cases, the ordinance calls for persons. And I think there needs to be not only consistency there, but I think some further definition. And this goes back to parking spaces too, you know, anyway.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, talking about the parking, if it's just a single dwelling, it should just be one parking space.
It's one family with one van.
Yeah, exactly. Even
well-
two, but
No, I'm just saying, you know,
Right. Well, as John said, but in a residential, you have to have 2 parking spaces per dwelling
per
unit.
dwelling.
So that doesn't seem unreasonable.
that's per our
Jesus.
residential zoning district. Yeah,
No, they wouldn't be.
so,
No, it would not be in a residential zone. I was using the standard
yeah,
to apply
yeah.
on the number of parking spaces.
Well, I don't know where
or what?
Cause I've been to,
I was
you know,
looking for the-
Airbnbs in the city where they don't have any parking and you have to
Absolutely.
go put it in an overnight garage.
Absolutely.
So.
Oh, okay.
All right, you guys have to discuss that in your volunteer
Yes.
meeting.
So are there any other things that the subcommittee should be discussing?
Well, I think we should go back to John's list in his cover memo to make sure that from a 30,000 foot view, we have the impressions of the commission with regard to those questions. So for instance, by right or special land use, John, could you give us a little bit of a lesson, if you will, on the differences between those two and what process the short-term rentals would go through under either circumstance?
Well, if we're gonna allow short-term rentals in the business districts, then you may have conversion of buildings, second floor, for short-term rentals. And the thought is, do you want those by right without really requiring a site plan, or do you want to be able to take a look at what that short-term rental is going to do relative to other parking requirements on the property and circulation and any impacts to the adjacent properties?
Of course, I'm personally, and I may be alone on the commission on this, or I don't know. I'm personally in favor of anything that is done by administrative review that is possible. On the other hand, if it comes to site development, as you're talking about, obviously the planning commission has an important role in helping the community develop in the way that the long-term plan suggests. So that's a tricky question. Where do we draw the line between administrative review and bringing it back to the planning commission? So it's a great question.
You know, if we're only going to have a cap of whatever, 33 to 40, it's not like one building is going to be transitioned into just short-term rentals, or we're going to have one and it's going to have 40 in it. You know,
The extra 7, I mean, they're available.
yeah.
That managed to apply on time and get selected and.
Yeah, but they could.
So I think John brings up a good point that if they're going to change the use, there are going to be logistics that maybe we need to look at. I don't know what control we have
See,
downtown.
the difference between when you have residential, typically on the second floor of a commercial building, and it's a year-round residence.
Right.
the chances are the people that live there are going to work during the day. And so they're not going to have a lot of competition for the same parking spaces as the ground floor use. But with a short-term rental, the people could come and spend a week and they're going to compete for those parking spaces on the commercial lot. And that may be the trigger, that if the combination of commercial parking requirements and residential parking requirements exceeds the amount available on site, then maybe that triggers a special land use review by the planning commission. If it doesn't, then it just goes through administrative review. But that's the problem I can see is having some limited parking, because some of these lots, businesses don't have a lot of parking to begin with. They're very small commercial lots, especially in the older part of 31 here, right from the downtown. And there may be competition for the spaces if they have a STR on the second floor. You just want to have a trigger in there that maybe if the combined parking of both the commercial office and the short-term rental exceeds the demand or the number that's currently on the lot, then maybe you need to go through a special land use review, see if it's going to work or not.
So further discussion by the select subcommittee then?
Mhm. So by right or special land use doesn't need to be a blanket thing.
You can have a trigger.
Seems reasonable.
Okay, and then we have already agreed on no ground floor, only upper floors. And discussion of STRs will compete with other district land uses. I think that's been addressed if we allow the first floor to be commercial. And then determination of the ADU can be or should be used for an STR. Is there consensus on that one?
Well, we've already said not residential and ADUs are.
Well, I think the whole reason we
so-
did that was
Mhm.
to create
Housing.
housing.
Okay,
And then back to special conditions, but. It is number 4.
all right. So does anybody offhand, besides parking, have anything so it triggers boy, we should be considering this?
Well, some of the ordinances have, I don't know how complex you want to get, but some of the ordinances have addressed things like no music after a certain time at night. And you can't start it up at a certain time in the morning. And, as these short-term rental ordinances are enacted across the state, and then some communities have a little bit more experience than others, we're starting to see where they're starting to kind of put the finger in the dike relative to some things that they didn't think about. But music can be an issue, especially if you're in a lot of the business districts along 31 are behind it are residential properties. So somebody's out on their deck at midnight playing rock and roll, that could be disturbing to some of the neighbors. So is that something that you want to put a cap on, for example?
No, that's a great example and brings up the question of, is that something that should be in the ordinance or in the lease? And one of my many questions was, should one of the licensing requirements be approval of the lease that is used for the short-term rentals?
That could be one of the requirements, yes.
So, and maybe it should be in both. Maybe it should be in not only the lease, but in the ordinance. But if it's in the lease, then the person who's actually renting they see it. Whereas if it's in the ordinance, they may not see it.
And correct. I think the way that the police power ordinance was set up is that the city would provide the licensee with kind of a list of general city rules. Okay, and that could be in the rules. If they violate the rules, then they are subject to losing their license if there's several violations. So that's where you would have things like garbage, refuse, where you're going to put refuse, music, a lot of those kind of fundamental things you would put in the document that would get attached to the license. So the licensee knows what their rules are.
Yeah, I'd still love to see that also, in addition to that, an approval of the actual lease they're using with the renter to make sure there's consistent communication with the people who are renting the property.
That'll be kind of a discussion issue that will have, the
Yeah.
city council will have to undertake if they want to get into that,
Okay.
taking a look at the lease.
Yeah, that's a lot of staff time.
Yeah.
Typically, they don't. Typically, they.
Well,
they use it.
If staff wrote a lease and said, you have to use this lease, it'd be easy. But
Yeah, I don't.
Under Airbnb.
Yeah, because
Okay.
they're all separate businesses and I don't think we can dictate that.
We can dictate anything we want. And Kidding.
Oh, one question. In terms of the waiting list, when you get put on that waiting list, is it when you've completed everything or when they initially receive an application that's incomplete?
The way the waiting list is set up, if you were on the waiting list and you were called by the city saying that you have an opportunity to get a license and you wanted to pursue the license, then you would have an opportunity then to fill out all the application materials.
Okay,
You wouldn't have to do that ahead of time.
You wouldn't have to do that ahead of time.
But
You
is-
get your name on the list of being interested.
okay, so getting on the waiting list is calling and saying, I want to be on the waiting list.
Correct.
Got it.
And you have to maintain your name
Yeah,
every year. So if you don't
Right.
call back and say, keep me on the waiting list,
mhm.
you drop off.
Well, and also pay a fee.
Yeah, it's almost like what the city does with the waiting list for the marina.
So you don't have to call back every year. They send
But-
you a letter.
Well, yes,
But that's in here. That's in here that they will.
But there's a second stage, and that is that the application needs to be deemed correct by the city clerk. Correct and complete.
but
And that's a secondary list because you might not make it to the head of the next available short-term rental if the city clerk says your application, even though you're number one on the waiting list, your application is not complete.
correct, you would get a letter from the city or a phone call or an email saying that you're next on the waiting list and the license is available. And you have 30 days or whatever that time frame is to submit your application. If the application is deemed not to be complete and you don't want to resolve that within that time frame, then you lose that opportunity and it goes to the next person.
Okay. Any more discussion? Okay. We want to move on then. Public comment. I see we do have two people on Zoom.
I think we have a motion on the floor too,
Oh, I thought we voted.
on the subcommittee. Did
Yeah,
we did, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. All right, so
You're on
I can keep reading.
Taking me away too long.
this is the time for public comment for items not on the agenda. If anybody would like to do that, just speak up now. All right. We move on to commissioner comments. Are there any commissioner comments? All right. Updates. Who's doing updates tonight?
Well, actually, I had a couple of questions. Maybe that'd help with the updates.
Oh, right, okay.
Where did I put them here? What is the status of hiring and or budgeting an enforcement officer?
Over the past month, we've posted the position, we've closed that posting, we received. I'm looking around, I'm gonna say that maybe 6 applicants. We're moving forward with 3 applicants that we'll be interviewing next week.
Great.
Do we have a job description for that?
Yes.
And does it include?
Yes.
What does it include? Everything?
Yes.
Okay, yes. My next question was actually not for you, Shane. So it was draft status of the new sign ordinance. I understand that the language that currently exists on the books was not regarded as being legally defensible, and therefore previous planner was working with city attorney on an entire new sign ordinance language. And I was curious to know what the status might be of that.
I will check with Matt and find out where that's at.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was gonna have to come back to the planning commission and we're just trying to get on our feet here, so.
Well, I understand.
So
we want to change
that
transition here, but
We haven't
Sign
even met.
committee meeting in the near future, and we can pick up.
because we had previously established that as a pretty high priority. I was just curious where we were on that. And then the other question was, does staff at this time have a current list of other planning commission priorities and how what we hope to address in the short term and the longer term?
I am going to get with the chair. We had a preliminary conversation on that. And I'm going to try working with the chair to synthesize that down to 3 or 5 type priorities that you should work on based on your goals in the master plan.
Beautiful. Thank you. But those were my comments.
Okay. Lisa, are there any updates from you?
Lofts at Lumber Square they are planning on coming back at the May meeting. They weren't able to get all of their stuff submitted in time for this meeting, so their plan is to come back in May.
Okay,
That's all I've got.
all right.
Just a question on this ordinance number 787 that was on our desk when we arrived.
Oh, I asked for that to be, because we were gonna discuss ADUs. And so, since it's not in our zoning ordinance, I asked for that to get printed out, so if we did need a discussion on it,
Okay,
this is where it says it has to be 3 months.
gotcha. Okay,
Yeah,
I
so
just
we-
wanted to make sure that's,
Yeah, it was just for us for discussion about ADUs.
all right, thank you.
So we can adjourn. And we adjourn at 7.